Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey, Herman and Corn. So we talked about urbanism in a number of episodes, and population density, and this idea that the world is becoming more urban. We mentioned in that episode urban farming, and it got me thinking because I went on a urban planning book purchasing run the last time I was in the US because my wife is an architect, so I figured that if I didn't read them, she would, which is actually exactly what happened. I made it 100 pages through one, but it was kind of like Jane Jacobs. Urbanism books, for some reason, it's a very hard genre to approach, which I think is kind of disappointing because I'm just curious, but I was suddenly reading these philosophical essays and I was looking at the cover and thinking, did I pick up the right thing? So I didn't make it through that one, but it has a beautiful book art cover that actually doesn't really make a lot of sense because the contents are kind of less colorful, but it shows this vision of skyscrapers with these farms inside of them, and it's an image that really connects with me because I'm one of those odd people who, if you gave me a building that had everything I needed, like a gym, a bar, what else does one need in life besides a home and those things, a co-working space, and somewhere to buy groceries, I could probably leave like once a week, whereas other people would get cabin fever even if they had all those things. So the idea that we can have these multifunctional buildings in urban spaces where living space, commercial space, and even agriculture is just all kind of blended in sounds amazing to me. However, at least here in Jerusalem, I don't see much urban farming actually going on. There's currently this whole thing with the dairy farmers up in arms about the cost of imported dairy coming down, and they haven't responded by creating a skyscraper full of cows. That would be an interesting experiment. So the couple of things I have seen in Jerusalem for urban farming are very small scale and very pilot level in scale. We're talking about one building and one rooftop, where a collective comes together to show that it's feasible, but it's much more at the proof of concept stage than it is at anything that's going to really make a significant difference to how food is produced. And we talked about how much food Israel actually imports in our episode about Israel's independence and self-sufficiency. So my question, Herman and Corn, is we always look for case studies on this podcast, and I'm curious to know, urban farming, is there any cities we can point to where it's moved a bit beyond that, where there's actually a significant amount of food that has been grown in urban areas? And my conception of an urban farm, for whatever reason, is probably just the diagrams that I've seen when it's been in the media and now the AI generated images, but it's always actually been skyscrapers or very high-rise buildings with urban farms in them. Is that, in terms of what we've actually seen work so far, is there any correlation between the size of buildings and where urban farming can be conducted, or is it not necessarily? Do rooftops provide a better area? And we obviously have to think about sun, and so many crops require sunlight in order to grow. So I presume that means that it is the things like the perspective become really important. And I'm thinking specifically about a very built up urban area where you've got a lot of tall buildings in all directions. How, in the context of an urban farm that is not on a rooftop, it's on an intermediate floor, how does that actually work? How do they ensure that it gets sufficient sunlight, and can it be done? Herman and Corn, Excuse me, Corn, for butchering your name there momentarily. Let's talk about urban farming today. Is it really a viable thing? Is it going to be a thing? And if we become more urbanized, as we are becoming, is there ever going to be a tipping point where we can actually produce a significant or even majority of our food all within the confines of cities? Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother. It is a beautiful, albeit slightly chilly, February evening in 2026, and we are looking out over the stone walls of the city, thinking about how much has changed in just the last few years.
Herman Poppleberry here and ready to dive into the dirt, or maybe the lack thereof, depending on where this conversation goes. It is funny, Corn, looking out at Jerusalem, you see a city that has been built and rebuilt for thousands of years, mostly out of heavy, solid stone. It is the last place you would expect to see a high-tech agricultural revolution, yet here we are.
It is funny you say that because our friend Daniel was just talking to us about this. He has been going through a bit of an urban planning phase lately. I think he bought a stack of books during his last trip to the United States and has been trying to make his way through them. He mentioned some of the imagery on the covers, these futuristic skyscrapers filled with lush greenery and farms on every level. They look like vertical forests, almost like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, but with LED lights and hydroponic tubes.
I know exactly the books he is talking about. They often look like something out of a science fiction movie, maybe a bit too optimistic. But it is interesting because Daniel brought up a real-world point about what is happening right here in Israel. He was mentioning the dairy farmers who have been protesting lately over the cost of imported dairy and the rising price of land. He joked that they haven't exactly responded by building a skyscraper full of cows yet.
Can you imagine the structural engineering required for a cow skyscraper? The weight alone would be a nightmare, not to mention the waste management. But it raises a really good point. We see these beautiful renderings of vertical farms, and we hear about small community gardens or rooftop pilots. But Daniel's question is really about scale. Are there cities that have actually moved beyond the pilot phase? Is this a real industry yet? Or is it just a niche hobby for wealthy urbanites who want $5 basil?
That is the big question. And the answer is actually quite surprising if you look at a few specific spots around the globe. We are in 2026 now, and the hype cycle of the early 2020s has settled into what I would call hard-nosed reality. Singapore is probably the best example we have right now. Because they are a small island nation with almost no traditional farmland, they have made food security a matter of national defense. They have a goal called 30 by 30, where they want to produce 30% of their nutritional needs locally by the year 2030.
30% seems like a huge jump from where they were just a few years ago. I remember reading they were at less than 10%.
It is massive. Historically, they imported over 90% of their food. So, to hit 30%, they have had to move far beyond community gardens. They have companies like Sky Greens, which has been around for a while but has scaled up significantly. It is essentially a vertical farming system that uses a water-driven pulley system to rotate troughs of vegetables. It looks like a giant A-frame structure, and it uses gravity and water to move the plants through different light levels. It is brilliant because it uses the weight of the water to power the movement, so the energy footprint is much lower than an elevator-based system.
So it is not just a static shelf, it is a machine.
Exactly, and that is the transition we are seeing. Urban farming is moving from biology into industrial engineering. Another great example is in the Netherlands. People often think of the Netherlands as a very rural place because of the windmills and tulips, but it is actually one of the most densely populated countries in the world. They are the second largest exporter of food in the entire world by value, right after the United States. And they do almost all of it through high-tech, climate-controlled greenhouses that are increasingly integrated into urban or semi-urban fringes. In places like the Westland region, the greenhouses are so dense they look like a glowing city from space at night.
That is fascinating. But when we talk about the skyscrapers Daniel was mentioning, the ones with farms on intermediate floors, how does that actually work? If I am a developer in a place like New York or Tokyo, why would I give up high-priced office space or luxury apartments to grow lettuce? The math just doesn't seem to add up when you look at the rent per square foot.
Well, that is where the economics get tricky. Usually, you don't. Most of the successful large-scale urban farms right now are either on rooftops or in repurposed industrial buildings, not in the middle of a grade A office tower. Take Lufa Farms in Montreal. They built the world's first commercial rooftop greenhouse back in 2011, and now they have 4 massive sites. Their latest one is over 160,000 square feet. They are producing enough food to feed tens of thousands of people every week. But they are using rooftops that were otherwise just sitting there collecting heat and contributing to the urban heat island effect.
Okay, so let's talk about the mechanics of that. Daniel asked about the correlation between building size and the feasibility of farming. If you are on a rooftop, you have the sun, but you have weight issues. If you're on an intermediate floor, you have weight issues and no sun. How do they balance that?
The weight is actually the biggest hurdle that people underestimate. Most people think about a garden and think of dirt, but a foot of wet soil can weigh over 100 pounds per square foot. Most modern office buildings are designed for a live load of maybe 50 to 80 pounds per square foot. So, if you just dump a bunch of dirt on a standard floor, the floor might literally collapse, or at the very least, you would see massive structural cracking.
So you can't just move into an old apartment building and start a farm.
Not without major structural reinforcement, which is incredibly expensive. This is why almost all serious urban farming uses hydroponics or aeroponics. In hydroponics, you are using nutrient-rich water instead of soil. In aeroponics, you are just misting the roots. This reduces the weight significantly. You are basically just supporting the weight of the water and the physical structure of the racks. Even then, you have to be careful about where you place the tanks. You usually want them over the structural columns or the elevator core where the building is strongest.
And what about the intermediate floors? If you are in a dense city like Jerusalem or New York, and you have a 40-story building next to you, you are in the shade half the day. How do you get enough light to grow anything significant?
This is where the technology gets really cool and also really expensive. There are a few ways they handle it. The most common way now is total environmental control using LED lighting. You aren't even trying to use the sun. You are using specific spectrums of light, mostly red and blue, which is why those indoor farms often have that weird pinkish-purple glow.
Right, I've seen photos of those. It looks like a neon disco for plants.
It kind of is. Plants don't actually need the full spectrum of sunlight to grow. They mostly need specific wavelengths for photosynthesis. By using LEDs, you can give them exactly what they need, 24 hours a day. You can actually make the plants grow faster than they would in nature because there are no cloudy days, no nights, and no seasons. You can have a harvest every few weeks, year-round.
But wait, if you are using electricity to power lights to grow food, doesn't that negate the environmental benefits? You are trading food miles for kilowatt hours. If the goal is sustainability, using a coal-fired power plant to grow kale seems counterproductive.
You have hit the nail on the head. That is the central debate in the industry right now. If you are using fossil fuels to grow lettuce in a basement, you are arguably doing more harm to the environment than if you ship that lettuce in a truck from a farm 500 miles away. But the math is changing. As the grid gets greener and LED efficiency improves, the energy per calorie ratio is getting better. Also, you have to factor in water. Vertical farms use up to 95% less water than traditional agriculture because the water is recycled in a closed loop. In a world facing water scarcity, that is a huge deal.
I wonder if there is a middle ground with natural light. I remember reading about heliostats, those mirrors that track the sun and reflect light into dark spaces. Could you use those to light an intermediate floor?
People have tried. There is a project in London called Growing Underground, where they are using old World War II bomb shelters to grow microgreens. They are using LEDs there, but there have been architectural proposals for light pipes or fiber optic cables that harvest sunlight from the roof and plumb it down into the middle of the building. The problem is efficiency. You lose a lot of the light's energy every time it reflects or travels through a cable. As of now, high-efficiency LEDs are usually more reliable and cheaper than trying to pipe in the sun.
It seems like we are talking about two very different things here. On one hand, you have the high-tech factory model, like the bomb shelters or the Singaporean towers. On the other hand, you have the rooftop community model, like Lufa Farms. Which one do you think is actually the future of the city?
I think they serve different purposes. The rooftop model is great for community engagement and what we call low-intensity agriculture. It helps with the urban heat island effect, it manages stormwater runoff, and it provides fresh produce. But it is never going to feed a city. To actually produce a significant portion of a city's food, you need the factory model. You need verticality, automation, and total climate control.
Let's dig into that feeding the city part. Daniel asked if cities could ever produce a significant portion of their own food. If we look at the caloric needs of a city like Jerusalem, with nearly 1 million people, could we ever actually grow enough?
If we are talking about calories, like wheat, corn, and rice, honestly, no. Not with current technology. Those crops require massive amounts of space, very specific soil conditions, and a lot of sun. To grow enough wheat for Jerusalem inside the city limits, you would have to turn every single building into a farm and move all the people out. It just doesn't scale for staples. A single acre of wheat only produces enough flour for about 9,000 loaves of bread a year. That sounds like a lot, but for 1 million people, you would need thousands of acres.
So the dream of the self-sufficient city is a bit of a fantasy.
For staples, yes. But for nutrition, that is a different story. We get our calories from grains, but we get our vitamins and minerals from perishables like leafy greens, herbs, tomatoes, and peppers. Those are the crops that urban farming excels at. They have a high water content, they grow fast, and they are very sensitive to long shipping times. If an urban farm can provide 100% of a city's leafy greens and herbs, that is a massive win for health, logistics, and food security.
That makes sense. I mean, think about how much of the cost of a head of lettuce is just the refrigerated truck that brought it here. If you can grow it 2 blocks away, you are cutting out a huge amount of waste. I have heard that some greens lose half their nutritional value within 24 hours of being harvested.
Exactly. And you are also cutting out food waste. About 30% of produce is lost in the supply chain because it spoils before it hits the shelf. If you harvest a salad in the morning and it is on someone's plate for lunch in the same zip code, your waste drops to almost zero. There is a company in Japan called Spread that operates a techno farm, where robots handle everything from seeding to harvesting. They produce 30,000 heads of lettuce a day in a single facility. That is the kind of scale that starts to move the needle.
You know, I was thinking about the building size thing again. If we're looking at these massive skyscrapers, like the ones Daniel saw in his books, is there an optimal height for a vertical farm? Like, does it get harder to farm the higher you go?
It actually gets harder because of the stack effect and air pressure. If you have a very tall building, the way air moves through it becomes a major engineering challenge. Plants need very specific humidity and CO2 levels. If you are on the 80th floor, maintaining that environment can be more expensive than on the 2nd floor. Plus, you have the logistics of moving tons of water and nutrients up and down. Every floor you add is more weight and more energy spent on pumping.
So maybe the skyscraper farm isn't the best design. Maybe it is more about mid-rise integration.
I think that is the consensus among urban planners right now. Instead of one giant farm tower, the idea is to integrate grow zones into existing infrastructure. Think about a parking garage. As we move toward more autonomous vehicles and better transit, many cities are finding they have too much parking. Those structures are perfect for urban farming. They are already built to handle heavy weight. Cars are heavy. They have high ceilings for airflow, and they are usually located right in the heart of the city.
That is a brilliant reuse of space. You already have the concrete slabs that can handle the load of hundreds of cars. A few hydroponic racks would be nothing for those floors. And you don't have to worry about the luxury apartment rent prices, because it is a parking garage.
Precisely. There is a company called InFarm that was doing something even more granular. Instead of a whole building, they put modular growing units directly inside grocery stores. You are literally picking your cilantro from the machine it grew in. It is the ultimate zero-mile food. Now, InFarm had some financial struggles a few years ago. They had to restructure in 2023, but the concept of point-of-sale farming is still very much alive. It is just about finding the right economic model.
It is funny how we have gone from these massive sci-fi visions of farm scrapers down to a box in a grocery store. It feels like the technology is finding its level.
It usually does. The hype cycle always starts with the most extreme version of an idea, but the practical application is often more subtle. But let's go back to something Daniel mentioned about the perspective of these buildings. He was worried about the sunlight for intermediate floors. One thing we haven't talked about is the double skin facade.
Is that like a thermos for a building?
Sort of. It is two layers of glass with a space in between. Architects are starting to design buildings where that gap, which can be several feet wide, is used to grow plants. It acts as a natural insulator for the building, it cleans the air, and it provides a bit of food. It doesn't require a whole floor, just a few feet of space around the perimeter. The plants get the natural sunlight, and the building gets a living skin that reduces cooling costs.
That sounds like it would be great for office morale too, having a literal wall of green right next to your desk.
Oh, definitely. There is a lot of research on biophilia, the idea that humans are naturally happier and more productive when they are around plants. So, even if the farm isn't producing enough food to feed the whole office, the psychological benefits might be worth more than the vegetables. In Tokyo, the Persona Group headquarters has an urban farm integrated into their office. They have tomato vines hanging over conference tables and rice paddies in the lobby. It is as much about the environment as it is about the food.
I can see that, but I want to push back on the viability part. If I'm an investor, and I see the high cost of LEDs, the high cost of urban real estate, and the complexity of these systems, is urban farming actually profitable yet? Or is it still living on venture capital and dreams?
That is the elephant in the room. A lot of the early vertical farming startups have actually struggled lately. Companies like AeroFarms and AppHarvest had some very public financial troubles in 2023 and 24. The problem was that they tried to scale too fast without perfecting the energy costs. They were building these massive $100 million facilities and then trying to sell lettuce for $2 a head. The math didn't work.
So the factory model is hitting a wall?
It hit a reality check. The next generation of urban farms, the ones we are seeing succeed now in 2026, is much more focused on automation and specialty crops. Instead of just lettuce, they are growing high-end herbs for restaurants or even pharmaceutical plants. If you are growing a specific type of basil that a chef will pay top dollar for, or a plant used in medicine, the high overhead of a vertical farm becomes much easier to justify. We are also seeing more integration with waste heat.
Waste heat? Like from a factory?
Or a data center. Data centers produce an incredible amount of heat. Usually, they spend a fortune on cooling to get rid of that heat. But if you build a vertical farm next to a data center, you can use that waste heat to keep the plants warm. It is a perfect synergy. The data center gets cheaper cooling, and the farm gets free heat.
That is the kind of circular economy thinking that makes this feel more viable. It is not just about the farm in isolation. It is about how the farm fits into the city's existing systems.
Exactly. There is a project in Stockholm where they are doing exactly that. They are using the excess heat from a data center to provide energy for a large-scale greenhouse. This kind of industrial symbiosis is the only way the factory model works long-term.
That makes sense. It is the high-value strategy. But does that mean urban farming will always be a luxury thing? Will it ever help with food insecurity in lower-income areas? Because if it is just designer basil for fancy restaurants, it doesn't really solve the problem of how we feed a growing urbanized population.
That is the real challenge. To make it work for food security, you need to lower the cost of the technology. We are starting to see some interesting low-tech urban farming in places like Nairobi or Mexico City. They aren't using LEDs and climate control. They are using vertical sacks or simple hydroponics on rooftops with natural sunlight. It is not as efficient in terms of yield per square foot as a Singaporean tower, but the cost is almost zero. In many ways, the low-tech version is more resilient because it doesn't depend on a complex power grid.
So maybe the answer to Daniel's question is that urban farming isn't one thing. It is a spectrum. On one end, you have the high-tech, LED-powered plant factories in Singapore, and on the other, you have a family in a dense neighborhood using a vertical garden to grow their own peppers and tomatoes.
Exactly. And both are important. The high-tech version provides the volume and the stability for the supply chain, while the low-tech version provides the resilience and the community connection. One of the most interesting developments in the last 2 years has been the rise of agri-hoods. These are housing developments built around a central farm. Instead of a golf course or a swimming pool, the main amenity is a professionally managed farm that provides food for all the residents.
I would much rather have fresh tomatoes than a golf course.
Me too. And it turns out it is a great selling point for developers. It creates a sense of community, and it actually lowers the food footprint of the entire neighborhood.
I'm curious about the cows in the skyscraper joke again. We have talked a lot about vegetables, but what about protein? We have talked about lab-grown meat in the past, but is there such a thing as urban ranching?
Not with cows, thankfully. The methane and the waste would be an absolute disaster in a city. But aquaponics is a real contender. That is where you combine fish farming with hydroponics. The fish waste provides the nutrients for the plants, and the plants clean the water for the fish. It is a closed-loop system.
I have seen some of those systems. They can be quite compact, right?
Very compact. You can have a tank of tilapia in the basement and a greenhouse on the roof. It is a very efficient way to get protein in a small footprint. And because fish are cold-blooded, they are much more efficient at converting feed into protein than a cow or a pig. A cow needs about 10 pounds of feed to produce 1 pound of beef. A tilapia needs less than 2 pounds of feed to produce 1 pound of fish.
So the urban farm of the future might be a parking garage with fish in the basement and kale on the upper floors.
It sounds weird, but it is actually one of the most logical ways to use urban space. Think about the circular economy aspect. A city produces huge amounts of heat and CO2. Plants love heat and CO2. If you can hook up an urban farm to the exhaust system of an office building, you are literally turning waste into food. There is a project in Sweden where they built a plantagen, which is a giant glass dome attached to an office building. The heat from the computer servers in the office is used to warm the greenhouse, and the plants provide oxygen and humidity back into the office. It is a symbiotic relationship.
That is the kind of second-order effect we love on this show. It is not just about the food, it is about the metabolism of the city. The city becomes a living organism that processes its own waste and feeds itself.
Precisely. And we are seeing cities start to change their zoning laws to allow for this. For a long time, farming was classified as an industrial or agricultural activity that wasn't allowed in residential or commercial zones. But cities like New York and Chicago have updated their codes to encourage rooftop and indoor farming. They are realizing that a farm isn't a nuisance, it is an asset.
Okay, let's look at the big picture to wrap this up. If we fast forward 20 years, do you think we will look back at this era as the beginning of a green revolution for cities? Or will these books Daniel is reading just be seen as beautiful, impractical art?
I think we will see a hybrid reality. We won't have farm scrapers on every corner, but I think it will become standard for new buildings to have some kind of productive greenery integrated into them. Maybe it is just a herb wall in the cafeteria or a shared rooftop garden, but the idea of a building being a passive consumer of resources is going to change. We are moving toward regenerative architecture.
I like that. The building as a producer. It is a shift in mindset.
It really is. And as the technology for LEDs and automation gets cheaper, the factory farms will become more common on the edges of the city. You might not see them, but your salad will be fresher because of them. We are also seeing a rise in personalized nutrition, where your home hydroponic system grows exactly the nutrients your body needs based on your health data.
That sounds a bit Brave New World, but also very efficient.
It is the ultimate weird prompt future, but at its core, it is just about getting back to basics. For most of human history, people lived close to their food. It is only in the last 100 years that we have separated the two so completely. Urban farming is just our way of trying to bridge that gap again, using the best technology we have.
It is a fascinating evolution. It makes me want to go look at those books Daniel has. Even if they are a bit visionary, they are pointing toward a real need. As we become an increasingly urban species, I think the stat is that 70% of the world will live in cities by 2050. We have to figure out how to stay connected to the things that sustain us.
Absolutely. And if we can do that while also making our cities more beautiful and resilient, then everyone wins, even if we never get that skyscraper full of cows.
Yeah, I think the neighbors might complain about the mooing anyway, not to mention the logistics of getting a cow into an elevator.
Probably for the best. Stick to the tilapia and the kale.
Well, this has been a great deep dive. I think we've covered everything from the structural loads of dirt to the neon disco of LED farming. It is clear that while we might not be self-sufficient anytime soon, the urban farm is moving out of the pilot phase and into the fabric of the city.
It is an exciting time to be watching this space. There is so much innovation happening, and I think we're going to see some really creative solutions in the next decade. We are moving from the what if phase to the how do we make it pay phase, and that is where the real progress happens.
Definitely. And hey, if you are listening and you have seen a cool urban farming project in your city, we would love to hear about it. Maybe you have a parking garage farm near you, or a grocery store with a cilantro machine. You can get in touch with us through the contact form at myweirdprompts.com.
And if you are enjoying the show, we would really appreciate a quick review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find us and helps the show grow. We are a small, independent operation, and every review makes a difference.
It really does. Thanks to Daniel for the prompt and for the excuse to talk about cow skyscrapers. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
We will see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. Keep growing.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.